Chinese society during the cultural years is the most equal, integrated society in the human history. The Chinese people were the happiest at the time. They worked together with the elites. So I came to the United States from China to get my advanced degree. When I read all the books written by Americans and some Europeans about the Chinese Cultural Revolution, I was shocked because that's not what I know about the Cultural Revolution. There are people who said Greedy Forward is a very, very big failure, right? That's also it's a consensus in the field. Many people think the Greedy Forward failed because some people said there are people starved to death. And I want to argue that's not always true.
Welcome to History Experience.
Hello everyone. Today I'm excited to welcome Professor Dongping Han. He's a history and political science lecturer at Warren Wilson College in North Carolina. We'll be discussing his book, The Unknown Cultural Revolution: Life and Change in a Chinese Village, which explores a neglected side of China's Cultural Revolution, highlighting how widespread education and empowerment contributed to profound political and economic changes. Thank you very much, Professor Han, for agreeing to join us.
You are welcome. Thank you for letting me talk about my book.
Would you like to introduce the book to the listeners?
My book is about what happened during the Chinese Cultural years from 1966 to 1976, the 10 years known as the Cultural Revolution. And there are a lot of books talking about the Cultural Revolution outside China, about how terrible life was like during their time period. So I came to the United States from China to get my advanced degree. When I read all the books written by Americans and some Europeans about the Chinese Cultural Revolution, I was shocked because that's not what I know about the Cultural Revolution. So I decided to write a book from the Chinese farmers' perspective, what happened during that time period and what change took place in their lives. So that's why I call it unknown Cultural Revolution, unknown to outsiders.
Before discussing the Cultural Revolution, I'd like to ask about the Great Leap Forward campaign initiated in 1958. You write that despite its failures, it had some successes. Could you discuss that?
In order to understand the Cultural Revolution, you need to understand what's going on before the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949. Okay, China was a very, very poor semi-colony and semi-feudal society before the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949. Okay, the countryside is ran down and land was concentrated in a small minority's hands. So many bankrupt poor farmers fled from the countryside to the urban area. And there were a lot of refugees, there are a lot of homeless in the big cities like Shanghai, Beijing. And in Shanghai, for example, at the time there was only about 2.5 million people. But on a given day, any given day, on average, 200 dead bodies were picked up on the streets. So it's very, very bad. The poor farmers couldn't survive in the countryside, so they have to flee to the urban area to survive. That's what's going on actually throughout the world, in India, in many, many other third world countries. And actually, in some ways, happening in the United States. And the poor farmers can no longer survive in the countryside. They have to flee to the urban area to looking for a way to survive. So after the Communist Party came to power in 1949, they began to think, what can they help the farmers to survive in the countryside? So they did one of the most thorough land reform in the world history. And in 1949, and before 1949, the Communist Party already initiated a land reform in the area they controlled. So there, in the Communist Party controlled area, yeah, the land reform already took place. After 1949, after the Chinese Communist Party took control of the whole China, they began to implement a land reform throughout the whole China. So the land reform was basically a redistribution of land. So farmers, each farmer, including the landlord, rich peasants, got equal share of land. In 1949, the so-called equal share of land is about 1/2 of an acre per person. That's about throughout China, and each person had about 1/2 acre per person. So at the time, the Chinese countryside, the farmers operate as a household. So each person has a 1/2 acre. If the family has 6 people, they have about 3 acres. Very small amount of land. But the poor farmers didn't have much capital, didn't have much farming implements. And so they lived very precarious life. It depends on the weather for their crops. And so at that time, if a poor farmer was sick and at the critical point of their life, if they were not able to work in the field and they missed the time, the planting time, and then the family will suffer in the future later. So the Chinese Communist Party in 1950, 51, 52 began to organize mutual aid groups in the Chinese countryside. The mutual aid groups were usually 5, 6 families, neighbors, and they pull their animals, farm animals, and implements together. So during the busy season, like planting, harvesting, they will help one another. If one of the family had a temporary difficulty, the other family will help them plant the crops. So in that way, it provides mutual help to one another. And this is a very, very important organization for the farmers. And it's kind of like this insurance mechanism. So one family had difficulty, other family will came in to help them. And so mutual aid groups was very, very popular at the time. And it lasted about from 1951, 52, and 53. So because the mutual aid group was very, very popular, and by 1954, there appeared in some of the villages in northern China, the lower level agriculture co-ops. The lower level agricultural co-ops usually was about 10 to 20 household, usually led by some of the Communist Party members or the activists in the village. And the lower level agriculture co-op, and people put in their land, their farm animals, and their big implements, and into the co-op, and they become shareholders. And people work together to farm the land. And at the end of the year, the produce will be divided according to this formula. So 50% of the produce will be distributed according to how much land, how much farm animals, how much implement you put into the collective, the co-op. And the other 50% will be divided according to how much work you put in the co-op. So it's 50%, 50%. And the collective would pay the tax to the government collectively. So individual didn't need to pay tax. In 1955, the Chinese central government did a survey study, and they found out about 70% of the lower level agriculture co-op had their yield increased. About 11% their yield decreased. And about 19% maintained their previous yield level. So it's was a very, very big success nationwide. So by 1955, 1956, there appeared in China the higher level agriculture co-op. The higher level agriculture co-op is bigger in scale. Normally it's one village, natural village, as a whole co-op. And their distribution mechanism or system has changed. Now 70% of the produce will be distributed not according to how much land they contribute to the co-op, but according to how many people you have in your family. And 30% distributed according to how much work you did in the co-op. So that's why it's called higher level co-op, because it's more socialist. And it's on a per capita income. 70% was distributed on the per capita basis. So everybody. And as long as you are part of a member of the co-op, you will get at least 70% of the produce. Only 30% are distributed according to how much you contributed. You worked in the field. And the co-op altogether also leave some money for collective welfare and for future investment, things like that. So the co-op, the higher level agricultural co-op, was a very, very exciting time for the Chinese young people. And at that time, the Chinese government was supporting the agriculture and put in a lot of effort. So the Chinese urban enterprises began to produce many, many new farm implements and develop many, many new seeds and developed many new fertilizers. So agriculture yield increased, and life in the countryside is very promising. Young people enjoyed working together other than individual household. So 1955, 56, 57 were a very exciting time for the Chinese young people in the countryside. And at the time, the Chinese Communist Party enjoyed very high popularity among the Chinese people because in the eyes of Chinese farmers, everything the Chinese Communist Party decide to do, they will be able to succeed. So the people are willing to listen to the party. At the same time, a lot of Chinese Communist Party members worked very hard with the farmers. I mentioned in my book, some of the Communist Party members had some shortcomings, but they did work very hard with the people. And many of these Communist Party members were tempered during the wartime and were dedicated party members. So by 1958, in the spring, and the communist, the People's Commune appeared in Shandong province, in a place called Chaishan People's Commune at the time. So Chairman Mao at the time was also touring the country. And in the spring of 1958, Chairman Mao was visiting a commune in Shandong. And the reporter asked Chairman Mao, how do he think about the People's Commune? And the Chairman Mao said, People's Commune is good. And the next morning, the headline appears on the Chinese newspaper. And the Chairman Mao said, People's Commune is good. So because Chairman Mao said People's Commune was good, and the whole country began to organize People's Commune. And in April 1958, in my hometown, Shandong Jima County, in the east coast of Shandong Peninsula, we had 1,050 villages in the county. And within 1 month, the whole county organized into 30 People's Commune. And around 50 villages a commune. And my hometown, my village in the Chongguan commune. And we had 50 villages in the commune. So in 1 month, the whole country, the whole county, basically the whole country, were organized into People's Communes. It's a very exciting time. I don't think anybody in history ever experienced such a drastic change in their lives. I interviewed many farmers and local leaders about that time period. And they all said that was a very exciting time. Young people in the country, in the villages, like the militia, the young Communist League, and the women's organization were organizing volunteer activities all the time. And they work more than 8 hours a day. They work as hard as they could. And 1958, for some reason, I don't know exactly what's the reason, they had the best harvest in history. The best harvest. I was 3 years old in 1958. I was able to remember some images. I remember there's some big sweet potatoes, as big as a child's head. I saw big piles of soybeans. I saw grain store filled with grains, and a lot of things never had in Chinese countryside began to appear, like public dining hall, like the kindergarten, like Minban school in the village. And all these things they didn't have before, now they had. And the farmers in China, particularly in northern China, never had enough to eat. They always had to calculate and budget their grain very, very carefully. The northern Chinese had an old saying: they will eat only porridges during the idle season when they don't need to work hard in the field, like winter and the early spring, things like that. They only eat solid bread and during the busy seasons. In the normal agriculture cycle in China, it's only about 3 months are busy seasons. The early summer wheat harvest season, about 1 month, and they have to harvest wheat and plant fall crops. That's a busy season, about 1 month. Then the fall busy season is about 2 months. And they have to harvest summer crops like corn, sweet potatoes, and plant winter wheat. So it's about 3 months, very, very busy. But in 1958, the Chinese farmers, with the encouragement and organization of the Chinese central government and local government, they turned into the whole year into a busy season. Okay? And the public dining hall, I want to see a few words here. The public dining hall in China, almost everybody, except farmers, had a public dining hall. The army, the hospital, the schools, and all the government sector, they have public dining halls. The public dining hall is not a restaurant. It's a dining service for they don't open to the outside. They only service their own employees. So at that time, you will hear a bell run, and the employees will start work and go to the public dining service to have food. The food usually cheap and well made for the employees. The farmers were the only people who didn't have public dining hall. So I remember at the time when at that time when we hear the bells ring in the schools, in the factory, we all were jealous. Other people had a public dining hall. So during the Great Forward, the Chinese farmers finally had their own public dining service. So every village set up their own public dining hall. They organized housewives to cook for the whole village. And nobody need to cook at home. So at the meal time, you can go to the public dining hall to eat. And you can eat almost as much as you want. There seemed to be plenty of food at the time. I interviewed many, many farmers in Henan, Shandong, Anhui, and they said they never ate so well like during the Great Forward. The public dining service, the managers of the public dining service tried very hard to cook the best food they could for the farmers. They never thought they wouldn't have enough if they eat too much. So 1958, despite they had a great harvest, a bumper harvest, and because they worked so hard on the product, the other reason they didn't carefully budget their grain supply. So by early spring in 1959, the public dining hall began to have short supplies of grain. So they were no longer allow people to eat as much as they could. They began to ration their food. So each meal, each person got a small bread, one bowl porridge, and this is not enough. And people began to feel hungry, and the Chinese farmers began to privatize uh, the people who work on the construction field or work in the field. So children and older people in the village began to have less food in order to make sure the people who need to work hard on the construction field need to have enough food so they can work harder. So there are people who said greedy forward is a very big failure, right? That's also it's a consensus in the field. Many people think the greedy forward failed because some people said there are people starved to death. And I want to argue uh, that's not always true. The greedy forward did had a grain shortage, and there were people who suffered. There's no doubt about that. But the greedy forward is also one of the most equal time in Chinese history. The Chinese history, if you look at the local gazette, look at Chinese history, almost there is a famine every year. There were always people who are starved. There's no doubt about that. And every time when the natural disaster hit, the poor people starved to death. We had an old saying in China called the big mansions. In the big mansions, wine and food went bad, while the hungry people starve on the road. So 朱门酒肉臭，路有冻死骨. That's how the Chinese describe the situation in China. But in 1958, 59, 1960, the situation is very different. And the food distribution was very equal. I wouldn't say absolutely equal, but more equal than ever before. The public dining hall didn't provide enough food for people's need, but it did provide everybody some food that's not available during the famine time before the greedy forward. The greedy forward was a difficult time, but the public dining hall did provide everybody something so they can survive until next crops. So there are some voices in China disagree with the outsiders' estimate with so many million people starved to death. I personally disagree with that estimate as well. I don't think many people starved to death. I do think a lot of people, the majority of Chinese people, were hungry, but very few people starved to death, exactly because the socialist practice of equal supply to people food. And looking back at the greedy forward, particularly inside, you look at what happening in China. The greedy forward is very important for China, for the rise of China into this world. And I mentioned the Chinese farmers worked very hard during the greedy forward. They built 84,000 large reservoirs throughout China, more than the total number combined. I visited many big reservoirs in China. The Xinfengjiang Reservoir in Guangdong Province, and it contains 140 billion cubic water. And in my hometown, in 1959, that 1 year, built 3 big reservoirs, and we are still using today. So these reservoirs, for the first time, began to turning the Chinese land into irrigated land. So before the Great Forward, the Chinese farmers rely on the weather for their harvest. After Great Forward, they no longer rely on the weather alone. They can use the reservoirs to irrigate their land. So the Great Forward famine was the last famine in the Chinese history for that reason. And I, of course, worked in the fields from 1964 until I left the village in 1978, 14 years. During these 14 years, there were drought, there were flood, but the crops never failed. The yield maybe fluctuate according to weather, but we always had enough harvest to feed everybody in the village. So Great Forward is very big important in build up the infrastructure for the Chinese agriculture. Another reason I would argue the contribution of the Great Forward is consolidate the grassroots organization of the Chinese countryside. The Chinese people today talk about the rural problem as a three-food crisis. The reason they call it three-food crisis because it involved agriculture, involved farmers, and involved the rural area. Actually, these three-food crises were going on for a long time throughout the world. In America, for example, and the main impression, indication of the three-food crisis regarding the rural area farmer and agriculture is very apparent. So, not long ago, about 80% of Americans were farmers. But in less than 100 years, today, there were only 2% of farmers left. So the farmers were not able to survive in the countryside. They have to flee the village to the urban area to looking for employment, looking for new livelihood in order to survive. And that's going on worldwide. That's happening in the US. It's also happening in Europe. I think Europe today maybe have a 5 or 6% of farmers left. But still, I think that's too little, too few. We need more farmers. The Chinese, because the Great Forward, because of the collectivization, the Chinese government and the Chinese society helped themselves to maintain a large percentage of farmers in the countryside. I think it's a very good thing for China, and it's a very good thing for the world. And for that reason, the Chinese didn't suffer the way Americans suffer today. China still have about 50% farmers living in the village, living in the rural area, the farming. Okay, so that's one reason I think there was some success in Great Forward. Another important aspect is the Chinese industry take off during the Great Forward. And you come to the United States, you go to Europe, you don't see many industrial enterprise in the counties, right? You don't see many of these small industrial enterprise in the small towns and county towns. But in China, during the Great Forward, many counties, in many communes, many villages began to build up industrial enterprises. And that's very important for the Chinese modernization and industrialization. So Great Forward is very important for China for that reason.
The book addresses the significant problems that existed before the Cultural Revolution, specifically the corruption among rural Communist Party leaders and the culture of submissiveness among the villagers. Could you elaborate on that?
The reason why Mao later launched the Cultural Revolution is after the Great Forward failed, and the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government began to look why the Great Forward. And some people argue it's a 70% weather and 30% human behavior, human wrong behavior. And that's Chairman Mao's evaluation. And there are some people argue it's a 70% human error and 30% weather. And in many places, and farmers were very angry with their local officials. They began to point out the village leaders ate too much, and they were not uh, work hard enough with the farmers. So, in order to pacify the farmers, the Chinese government began to had they call it the full cleanup movement in 1962, 63, 64. And the full cleanup is to make sure the Communist Party leaders, local leaders in the village, were real Communist Party members. They didn't do like the old officials just for their families and for themselves. And they want to make sure they didn't steal from the collective. And I remember in some of the Anhui villages I visited, and all the local officials were rounded up by the Communist government, and they were bound up, and they were taken away from the village to educational camp, and asked them to confess when they made some mistakes, things like that. And in my hometown and in Shandong, some of the places I visited, and all the local officials, village officials, were forced to confess how much they take from the farmers. So local officials were forced to confess their misconduct during the Great Forward. And some were forced to give up their furniture, their bikes, their watches, and their radios and all that. And my uncle was the local village deputy party secretary, and he was forced to turn in his bike to the village government, and he lost his position because and some people accusing him of stealing money from the collective. My mom told me the story. The village accountant and steal 1 yuan from my mom's paycheck each time. He get a paycheck from my mom was doing embroidery for a local enterprise, and his pay usually about $10 each time, and 10 yuan each time, and the village accountant will take 1 yuan out of it without telling my mom. So during that campaign to clean up the corruptions, and that accountant confessed he actually steal 1 yuan from each person's paycheck, and every time that happens. And so it was very thorough campaign to clean up corruption. But Chairman Mao think that campaign was too wide, and the scope was too big, and too many local officials were targeted. So Mao argued the problem is not the local officials. The problem is upper level officials, and particularly after going forward, there were a lot of Chinese central and provincial leaders and advocating going back to private household farming. So they want to disband the collective. More think that's the problem, not the local officials. So that's why I think we still argue today why Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. Mao want to make sure the Chinese farmers, workers understand the socialist route is the best for the farmers and the workers. And so the Cultural Revolution is an educational movement. And to educate the Chinese farmers to understand how to defend their rights as citizens. Okay, so during the fall cleanup and during the initial agricultural revolution years, and the Chinese Red Guard, mostly educated young people, middle school graduates, high school graduates, began to rebel against the local officials with the encouragement of Chairman Mao. They discovered the local police arrest too many innocent people. And I remember the statistics in Jima alone, 70% of the arrest was not justified, and many people were held in prison wrongly. So the reason why that took place is a twofold. One fold is the local officials and were careless. They don't care about the misery, the suffering of the people. And on the other hand, it's also the local people were not powerful enough, were not empowered enough to fight back. So to solve part of the problem, that's why we need to launch the Cultural Revolution. Okay, and I remember the at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, I was 11 years old, and educated high school, middle school students, and in some cases even primary school students began to challenge their teachers, and they were began to writing big character posters denouncing the figures of authority in their school and in their village, and it became a new current, a new social climate, and they were no longer fear the people in power, in authority. So I think that part of the Cultural Revolution is very important, and to train the young people, they don't need to fear the people in power. They don't need to fear the figure in authority. And I was in third grade at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And I remember my classmate and I, and we contribute together to bought a printer, and you write on the stencil paper and print pamphlet. And we wrote some, we copied other some, and we distribute among the market. We organized a small Red Guard group, about 10 people, and we did a lot of that. We worked well. We took it very, very seriously, and we wrote on the stencil paper and printed 500 pages of the pamphlet, and we published one issue each every 5 days, and distributed on the marketplace. And in the middle school, my county only had one middle school, high school at the time. The high school had 12 student newspapers, and at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And I think that social climate is very, very important to build the Chinese democratic spirit. And people openly challenge the officials and debate with the officials and criticize the officials with big character posters. And my mom never went to school, and he didn't know how to read and write her own name. But my mom asked me to write a big character poster for her to air his complaint about the production team leaders. So everybody was empowered to criticize the leaders at the time. I think for that reason, it's very, very important to to understand the Cultural Revolution was a democratic movement in many, many ways.
Wow. How is Cultural Revolution viewed in China today?
This is a very, very interesting story. So when Chairman Mao passed away, it's very sad. The Chinese Communist leaders at the time, gone for, right? Chairman Mao's wife, Zhang Chunqiao, Wang Hongwen, Yao Wenyuan, and Mao's nephew, Mao Yuanxin. And Mao actually wanted his wife to succeed him. That's Mao's plan. And now from Mao's Chinese archives, this is just, you see, leaked out. Mao's really uh, successor, Mao intended successor, Mao's wife, and the so-called Gang Fu. But there were other people in the Communist Party leadership at the time, Hua Guofeng and Wang Dongxing, who were not on very good terms with the Gang Fu. So about 4 weeks after Chairman Mao's death, Hua Guofeng and Wang Dongxing, the two of them, the two conspirators, and initiated a coup. So they arrest the Gang Fu and Chairman Mao's nephew, Mao Yuanxin. And this is the first time the Chinese Communist Party used these extraordinary means to solve their internal disputes, right? Differences. In a way, Hua Guofeng and Wang Dongxing, they didn't have a political disagreement. They were all support Chairman Mao's line. They all want to continue the socialist path in China. But by arresting the Gang Fu, Chairman Mao's wife, and his most valued young leaders at the top is where set up very, very big political bug. You need to explain to the people why you did that, right? You cannot just happen. People need explanation. And this provided people like Deng Xiaoping and other people who lost power during the Cultural Revolution years. They use this opportunity. They use this split among the top leaders to gradually come out. So in 1977, starting from 1976, actually, late 1976 and 77, Hua Guofeng and Wang Dongxing began to purge people who were closely related to with Gang of Four, from the central government to the provincial government until to the county level government. Anybody who support the Gang of Four were purged. 100 million people end up in prison. Nobody talk about this outside China, but that's the truth. They just ask the official to tell them, do they support the Gang of Four? If the answer was yes, you lose your power. You end up in jail. I interviewed many, many people. Shandong provincial government had 31 members. 30 end up in jail because they support the Gang of Four. Because they didn't know the Gang of Four were already arrested. So it's very, very big purge. And when Hua Guofeng and Wang Dongxing finished their own purge, they lost their political and social base in China. So within 2 years, those people who was with the coup were forced to resign. Hua Guofeng resigned the last. Wang Dongxing and Wu De, Chen Xilian, and Ji Donghui, all these political bureau members were forced to resign within 2 years. So eventually, Deng Xiaoping, the one Mao dismissed last in 1976, in April 1976, finally able to came back. And when he came back, he began to tarnish Mao's image, and they began to see Chairman Mao made mistakes in his late years, and they began to opening criticizing Mao's Cultural Revolution. They began to openly see 70% of Mao's life was good and 30% was bad. And basically, everything Mao did was negated by Deng Xiaoping. They didn't openly see that, but they basically, so in a general term, 70% of Mao's life was good, 30% was bad. So basically speaking, everything Mao did was bad. His educational reform was condemned. His healthcare reform was condemned. His industrial management style was condemned. I don't know whether you heard the Chinese industrial management style. It's called 2餐一改三结合. 两餐 means the management staff participate in manual labor, and workers participate in management. Reform unnecessary regulations and rules. How do you reform? Let workers and farmers participate in building the rules and regulations. Not the management dictate what's the rule and what's the regulation. Three, cooperation. Workers cooperate with engineers. Workers cooperate with management to get things done. It's no longer the management tell the workers what to do. It's not the engineers tell workers what to do. It's engineers, workers, and the management work together to get things done. That's what Mao called the Chinese industry management style. It's a model used during the cultural years throughout the Chinese society. Workers have the right to tell the management what they did was wrong or right. So management had to be supervised by workers. The management no longer were able to dictate what's happening in the country, in the factory. Another very important agriculture Chinese society during the cultural years was the official to work with farmers had to work with workers. They were no longer live a separate life. They live together with farmers. They live in the similar houses and they eat similar food and they have to work regularly with farmers. And their children had to go to same school with farmers' workers' children. Chinese society during the cultural years is the most equal, integrated society in the human history. The Chinese people were the happiest at the time. They worked together with the elites. And if they have problems, they can go to these officials and demand a solution right away. So all these were condemned by Deng Xiaoping. In 1978-79, they began to see Chairman Mao's policy and practice was ultra left and need to be condemned. And officials need to be in charge. They should be able to tell the workers what to do. So in Mao's time, the workers, the engineers, the management were paid about the same. Everybody knew how much each person was paid. But in Deng Xiaoping time, he called it the manager's responsibility. The manager has the exclusive right to decide how much a person get paid, how much reward a person can get. And the workers had no say in management decisions. As a result, the socialist industrial practice collapsed. Managers became owners, and the workers had no say in the factory management. So corruption went up very, very quickly. The Chinese society during Mao's time, there were almost no crime. There were no crime. You don't see police. You didn't see police in Chinese society. By the end of the Cultural Revolution, there were about 1 million people in my county. The police department had only 36 people, and they were not uniformed, and they were not armed. My village, my commune, had no one crime in 10 years. And the whole county maybe has 5 or 6 crimes each year. But after Deng Xiaoping's so-called reform, crime doubled, redoubled in a very, very short time. I think by early 80s, the Chinese crime rate went up 20 times. The number of police went up 10 times. And still going up. So in 1983, Deng Xiaoping had to introduce the so-called severely punishing crime campaign. It was introduced in 1983 in September, and more than 250,000 people were killed, were shot, and close to 1 million people were put in prison. It did 3 times, and I started a village in Henan province. That village had about 2,000 people. And during the cultural years, 10 years, there was not even one crime in that village. But in 10 years after Deng Xiaoping came back to power, more than 200 people end up in jail, and 2% were executed for petty crimes. So Chairman Mao's image was tarnished, and the Chairman Mao's policy was negated. And Deng Xiaoping's so-called reform introduced all these capitalist matters into Chinese society. And the Chinese society suffered as a whole. Official corruption went up. Crime went up. Prostitution was disappeared for 30 years in Chinese society, came back with a vengeance. Drug abuse disappeared in China for 30 years, came back with a vengeance. So what happened in the last 40 years? More and more people wake up. More and more people began to criticize Deng Xiaoping. And Chairman Mao enjoyed higher than before popularity in Chinese society. People openly condemning the capitalist rulers and imprisoning Chairman Mao's policies. So you can see there is a big, strong return of Chairman Mao's idea in Chinese society. I met a farmer said, I would give up my life if we can get Chairman Mao back into our society. That's very common among the Chinese farmers workers. They really, really hate what's going on in China today. On the one hand, life improved. On the other hand, the people's sense of happiness, enjoyment, is not as good as Chairman Mao's time.
Thank you. Where would you recommend readers to get your book and find more about your work in general?
I wrote a lot about the Cultural Revolution, about Chinese society today. And my book you can find on Amazon. It's very cheap because I didn't take any royalty. I said you can keep the royalty, so you can sell it cheap as you can. I think you can buy a copy of my book, maybe $5-6 even, very cheap. And you can type my name online. You will be able to find many of my writings. I think one of the biggest problem in the capitalism and in China today is the gap between the rich and poor. And as our society progress, we can produce enough for everybody to live adequately, live an enjoyable life, but we will never be able to produce enough to satisfy the greed of a small minority. So I think more and more young people outside China also began to realize that. And in order for a better future, in order for the survival of humanity, we need, the particularly young people, need to understand we need to build more socialist, more egalitarian society to make sure everybody can live with enough and live with dignity. A small minority cannot allowed to be dictated what they can do, right? That's democracy. We need real democracy. We don't need elites to dictate the direction of society.
Professor Han, thank you very much for joining us today, and I wish you continued success in your work.
Thank you. I enjoyed.